ZLS.
Boom. We're live.
Hey, how's it going?
Welcome everyone to ZLS 064. Bailey, awesome to have you on here, man. How you doing today?
Thanks for having me, Zach. I'm doing good. I feel like I just saw you. It's been like an hour since we were in our last meeting.
Yeah, that's cool though. To everyone in the chat, hi and welcome. Feel free to ask questions as we go. It's great to see everyone here. But yeah, Bailey, I really wanted to have you on because I feel like over the course of working together, we've had some really interesting conversations. Do you want to give a little background about how we know each other, what you do, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So obviously, my name's Bailey. I don't know if you guys noticed on the Twitter description, there was no link to a bio or anything. I'm not on Twitter. I don't have a blog really or anything, but I'm working on that. I'm a recent college graduate. I work in front-end web development on Capital One's website. Zach and Narwhal have been helping out Capital One as we migrate from AngularJS to Angular. And I'm sad to say that, well, it's kind of bittersweet. We're almost done, so Zach unfortunately won't be working with us too much longer. But it's been great getting to know Zach, and I've learned a ton from Zach and all the Narwhal folks. Yeah.
Very kind of you to say, man.
I guess just a little bit about my technical background. I was a CS grad. I consider myself a relatively proficient web developer and a passionate functional programmer whenever I can. That's about it.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of our conversations I feel like have sparked up because you keep telling me about closure scripts. Which no, I absolutely admire. So a lot of the talks that you sent me from Rich Hickey really changed the way. Well, it gave form to a lot of stuff I was thinking already, which has been super cool to see. So
Rich Hickey definitely has a way of articulating like technical concepts and like abstracting them out so they're not necessarily specific to a language. That I think, there's always stuff you can learn from watching his talks. It's just like a really educational software architecture. Like he's a really smart guy. All of his stuff is incredible.
Yeah. Well, for those of you that don't know, Rich Hickey is the creator of Closure, and yeah, it's if you haven't seen his talks, you should check them out. It's weird. Every time I see his talks, I think they're extremely good, but I don't see that many numbers on them, which is kind of surprising. So I don't know.
Are you talking like on YouTube, perhaps? Because I see a lot of his stuff was on like Vimeo. Or
more people need to start thinking this way. I feel like this is when I've talked to Closure programmers in the past. That's definitely the vibe I got from them, and I feel like you helped me finally drink the Kool-Aid, even though I'm not like programming in Closure yet. Definitely taken. I was definitely gravitating this way already, but really going into more functional and declarative paradigms in code. So
would it be beneficial to talk about Closure really briefly? Do you think people?
Yeah. Let's do that. Why don't you do it? Because I feel like you're more familiar with it than I am. So
I would consider myself a recreational closurist. That's what people who write in Closure call themselves.
Nice. It's not for medical purposes. It's just purely recreational.
But so Closure is a functional Lisp. And for people who don't know what a Lisp is, it's like an old Lisp was like one of the first programming languages. I think it was the second high-level language ever invented, but it's been around for a long time. Closure is relatively unique in that it considers itself to be a data-oriented language, meaning that everything is about data, just like manipulating raw data and transforming that data. Obviously, functional programming lends itself really well to working with data. But the Closure community has embraced a lot of really interesting ideas in programming languages. a lot of stuff that like gets implemented in other languages, but because Clojure was being kind of unbuilt from scratch in the last, like, I would say 12 years, rather than kind of working them into an existing language like JavaScript has been doing, Clojure has been able to kind of implement them at the language level, which is pretty cool. Yeah.
Sweet, man. So getting to ClojureScript though. So ClojureScript is a way of coding like web apps with Clojure essentially. And this was the part that when we first started talking about it, I was like, no, that doesn't make sense. Like, there's something about JavaScript or TypeScript, I guess, where I guess we're still like some level of abstraction away from what actually is running inside of the browser. But to be actually working with like native APIs or the APIs as they present themselves, there's something there. And like working with HTML and that kind of stuff. But so templating doesn't need to necessarily be done in markup language, right? And that's part of what like ClojureScript gets towards a little bit.
Yeah. So one thing I didn't touch on is that Clojure itself runs on the Java virtual machine. It's interpreted. ClojureScript is essentially Clojure that runs on the JavaScript virtual machine. So you can target like Node.js or like run it in the browser if you want. And since React has started embracing more functional components and like functional paradigms, the ClojureScript community has kind of blown up, because if you're going to be using React to write functional programs, why not use a functional language? If that makes sense. But yeah, to get to Zach's point, in Clojure or ClojureScript, one really awesome thing, interesting thing about Lisps is that you can kind of redefine the syntax of the language however you want. It gets like preprocessed, so you essentially write a macro that takes your code and spits out different code. So the way that works is like your markup is actually just raw Clojure data. It would be like writing your HTML inside of a JavaScript array, if that makes sense. But the way it's structured in ClojureScript, it actually makes sense, and it's a lot cleaner and more concise once you get used to it.
Yeah. Well, when you get into React a little bit, like I've had the opportunity to do recently, it definitely feels that like when you get into the TSX stuff, you definitely can see it's not that far of a stretch to go from like mapping an array to a series of TSX or JSX, like I don't know what you'd even call that, like slugs or chunks, really. Like it's very similar. I don't think it's that much of a leap to go from that to just like describing it purely as like some object or some JSON. So yeah, and that's essentially like for Clojure, JSON I imagine is not natively supportive, but I imagine they have like their own syntax for expressing like an object or expressing just raw data. Probably something a little more robust than a JavaScript object, right?
Absolutely. Actually, that's one of the big benefits of Clojure, and ClojureScript too, right? ClojureScript natively, like it syntactically supports vectors, lists, maps, sets, regular expressions, and I think there's one more that I'm forgetting. Where like if you think about JavaScript, like the kind of the native syntax is you have an array which you put in square brackets and a map which you put in, or an object which you put in curly braces.
Yeah. And that object's like kind of a hash map already, so you've kind of got that covered. And your array is really more of a linked list, but
the point is like when you want to use something to store like unique values, you'd have to either try to maintain like a unique values in an array, or you'd reach for like the JavaScript set,
right?
Isn't native to the language,
right?
If that makes sense. So like native Clojures and ClojureScript's like native data support is much more robust. There's actually like in a similar way that JSON is JavaScript object notation, there's what's called EDN, which is like closure data notation that can be sent across the wire as well.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
That's cool. But yeah, I've been watching this podcast by Lex Fridman. I don't know if you've heard of him. Have you, Bailey? He is a super interesting guy. Works. I believe he's been a professor at MIT in the past. He's a young guy though, and also worked at like AI stuff at Tesla. And he's talks about like Lisps quite a bit, like talking about how they're kind of cool playthings, but not something you would ever run in production. So I don't know how true that is. I feel like it may be true in practice and like what actually goes on for the majority of people. But the thing I'm finding from like, doing similar paradigms inside of, using RxJS inside of our Angular code, it actually is, I feel like it is better. It's ready. That stuff's ready for prime time. It's better conceptually once you get there. I know we had a discussion before, Bailey, about like, I think I used the example of baking a cake, right? Like if we think about baking a cake, I immediately think about doing it imperatively, right? Like you think through some list of steps and you say, okay, first I gotta get my sugar, then I gotta get my flour, and I gotta put them in the bowl, and then I gotta mix it, then I gotta throw an egg in there or something like that. But I think so when we were talking about this, I feel like your argument was that it's only thinking about that declaratively or thinking about that imperatively versus thinking about it declaratively is just either one's just as easy and it maps just as well to the way we think about things. Is that an accurate representation of your argument?
Yeah, I think so. I think one thing that I think it's kind of a shame, but it's just kind of the way it's seen. But I think when people think of functional programming, they tend to think of like map, filter, reduce, like the pretty like basic core functional programming operations.
Yeah.
So when I say like Clojure is a functional language, I think my first impression of it was like everything has got to be built on map, filter, and reduce. But that's not necessarily true. There are constructs in Clojure where you can iterate over, line by line. Actually get like an imperative, do this, and then this, and then this, and then this flow.
Well, yeah. So you still have that with like your maps and your reduces, right? Like you don't have to inline your maps and reduces. You can pass in this larger function towards it. Is that kind of what you're getting at in JavaScript? I'm thinking.
So you can more or less do things like, in JavaScript, you write like, var x equals something, var y equals something, var z equals something, right? And like, y can depend on x and z can depend on x and y. Like do like in the lines, you can more or less do that. That is what I'm trying to say. It doesn't all have to be in like map, filter, or reduce.
Gotcha.
You can essentially like assign variables line by line. But I also think that like from a functional like perspective, like mindset, if we think about like, baking a cake, right? The imperative mindset might be like, first I do this, and then I do this, and then I do this. Whereas like the way I might kind of conceptually think about it in a functional mindset is I take my ingredients, which is some collection of data, and I put it through the first step, and I take the output of the first step and I put it into the second step, and I take the output of the second step and I put it into the third, and so on until the output of the last step gives you a cake. Yeah. Which, if you think about that, that's just a chain of maps.
Yeah. Well, so it's like a it's each step there. If we think about breaking this down into its pieces, it feels like each step is a function. Is that where you're thinking? Okay.
Yeah, you could do like that. Yeah.
So you have some data, and each step through, you just define it as some functionality to use with your different parameters. So ingredients are the parameters, functions are what you're doing to them. And then, so when Lucas was on yesterday, he described everything in like, everything comes down to one of four things: a noun, which I believe we can like just map to data; a verb, which I think we can probably map to, functions or functionality. Then he said there's iterables, and there's what was the third one he said? I think the third one he said was sets. But or not sets, but like collections. I don't know. Maybe I'm giving him, maybe I'm doing him a disservice. But I know the third one was iterables. But yeah, so when you say like each one of those is a map, like where are you suggesting like at the start we start with all of our ingredients up front and then we map through each step, even if a parameter is not used, we're still taking all the ingredients at the start and mapping them through?
Yeah, so I was kind of picturing this like, well, I think the easiest analogy would be like the way you do it in RxJS, right? Where you have a source observable, and then you pipe on a mapping operator, and then transform that data in some way.
Yeah.
Really, all it's doing is just running a function that takes in data and spits out some new data. But you could chain like 3 or 4 mapping operators in a row, right? Like one corresponding to each step in the recipe is kind of the way I would see it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Whereas it's just, it's kind of like implementation independent. Like if you were doing that imperatively in JavaScript, you'd probably put them in functions too, right? Like the idea holds, you would just do them one in a row, in a row, in a row.
Yeah. So rather than doing one after the other, it would just be the call stack would be larger, right? Like you'd call all your functions inside of the previous one. Is that kind of the idea?
Kind of, yeah. Clojure is pretty cool. Getting back to what you mentioned about like Lisps not being in production. Lisps are not like the most efficient languages. Clojure aims to be efficient as much as it can. So it does a lot of optimizations behind the scenes. Yeah, more or less.
That's interesting. I always think of, just coming from where I come from, in terms of my experience, reaching for RxJS. I think RxJS is often, at least in Angular world, a huge performance increase. Because if you can, the way it works, right, is you have this Angular change detection engine that it's there to be our safety net. So we can do imperative things and we can do things wrong, and we can just say, okay, we're just going to set some properties on our class. We're going to let Angular change detection like run everything for us. So don't worry, it'll keep everything in sync. The problem with that is there's no way any system like that could be optimized just out of the box for any given scenario. And so you end up having this thing that's, I wouldn't say wildly inefficient, just like not, it could be better. Like you wouldn't, there's no way you need to run as many change detection cycles or go as far down in the tree as you'd have to do if you were just like setting properties on an Angular class. But if you were able to define like an observable stream, for example, I think the initial example I like to do is just like a counter of clicks. If you need to count how many times a button has been clicked inside of your component, for example, I think the immediate way most people would do is say, okay, just have a count variable on our class, and then inside of some method there, we're going to increase the value. We're going to plus that counter, and then we'll just tie that method to the click handler inside of our template. And that's like, if we get into like the easy and simple matrix, right? That's like a super easy solution, because that's something that everyone can like instantly reach to. Like anyone who's done any kind of code, anyone who's written a hello world can kind of grasp that for the most part. But you end up, if there's anything else going on with this component, every time it has to like change detect to see what's going on. We're going to recheck what that count is to see if it's changed when we really don't need to, right? And so it's, if you define that instead based on an observable that is itself going to emit, hey, I've just changed. We can like target that super precisely to say, okay, only run to change detection on like even this little part of our template if this observable has emitted a new value since the last time we checked. Which, I mean, when we talk about performance in the front end, it's almost a shame. Like what we think about is how much we're sending over the wire on the initial chunk, which, I mean, it's pragmatic. It's what actually matters for a lot of stuff like SEO and who can use our app. So those are huge metrics, obviously. But it's almost as a craftsman who enjoys like computer science, it's almost a shame to be like, that's the metric we care about. Like, can we make this snappier? Can we make this feel better to the user? And that's just a harder thing to put a metric on, and probably not as important overall. I don't know. My jury's still out on that. I really think that well-crafted software really does do a lot in terms of retention for your users. I think it builds a certain amount of loyalty there. I don't have much data evidence to back that up. It's more just more of a gut feeling that I imagine there is some way to objectively prove. But
well, I mean, I would completely agree. Like, just empirically, when I think of like good applications, I don't think of like laggy applications or slow applications, right?
Yeah.
And like sometimes you'll go to a website and you click a button and it's a little bit slow and you notice it. Like it's not like a huge significant impact on the user. But like the websites that work really well the first time through, like all the time, like those are the ones like you don't consciously notice it, but like those are much more pleasant to use.
Yeah. I will say, like for an example of the negative, like I won't say who it is, but my cell phone provider's website, just trying to log into this, I have to do this every now and then to invoice the cell phone bill, and like the sheer amount of redirects that happen the first time I log in, and the percentage of times I just end up stranded on a blank screen is really off-putting to the point where I'm like, I'm still with them because I have to be, but I wish there was some other way. I wish it was better. I feel like that's a big negative for any kind of brand loyalty I have to that brand. So
that's another really good point too, because like I put on my phone today, like checking the results from the election just on Google as like a quick search, right?
Yeah.
But on my phone, like their map is laggy. It's slow.
Which map is slow?
So if you just like Google election results, Google puts it on top of the page.
Yeah.
And
I thought that was actually decently well done. Is it slow on your phone?
It's like a little laggy on my phone. If you like, I wanted to see the results from the Senate. So like I tried to adjust on the little toggles, and I was like even if you get the website working well enough, like it might not work on older computers or phones, right, where there's slower processors in it. I think a lot of times we just kind of, it works on my machine, and I have a relatively new computer, so it works on everyone's machine. It's fast enough, but
yeah,
it's definitely true.
But I definitely feel like there's a well, it was small though. It didn't cost that much to send it over, so we're good. But I think those things in no way correlate, right? Like building better quality software does not require us to send more over the wire. In fact, often it's the opposite, right? So
Have you? Sorry, I'm gonna go on a little tangent here.
Go for it. This whole thing is a tangent because we're trying to bring this all back to like how Lisps are functionally, or how they're not as performant as imperative code. But
anyways, I've been doing some research into Gatsby because I'm working on a personal blog.
Nice.
But the philosophy in Gatsby is really interesting. Like, the idea is to take your application and compile it to something like that's as fast as possible. So like essentially to a developer, like you might send gibberish over the wire and it might not look like what you wrote, but it'll be fast.
Yeah.
Which is a really interesting idea.
Yeah. So I've been talking with Aaron. Aaron Frost is also on our team at Capital One, so it's kind of cool to see all that. But we've been talking about Scully a bit back and forth, and it's really interesting to see how that works. So it's like a little switcheroo, right? Like where you send initially just like HTML or just some text over the wire to get you to a first paint that you can then like simultaneously load that and your entire application and then like switch them out for each other. Is that essentially what Gatsby's doing as well?
So Gatsby's, I haven't looked into any of the more advanced usage, but it builds a static site for you. So it's the idea is that you write React components that get like compiled into just raw HTML files.
Okay.
It's similar to my understanding of Scully is that like you kind of get like an index for every route in your app. So no matter where the user navigates to, there's like an HTML file that they can load right away.
Right.
It compiles everything in one go. And then it handles things like link preloading and like scroll loading. So like if you loads a long page, it'll preload the rest of the page as it needs, or like load links that might be clicked on from the page so that when the user clicks on it, it's snappy. But it's a static site. It's not a full single page application, which is different than Scully, I think.
Yeah. So yeah, Scully's idea is to throw up HTML, throw up an HTML site for you first, and then to come behind that and give you like the full Angular site later seamlessly. And it's the thing I find that's so cool about it is if Scully can get everything figured out, I think correctly. I don't know if they're all the way there yet. I think they're pretty close though. It feels like you could drop Scully on top of an existing project and things for the most part without too much like too much elbow grease. You can get it to where your app that you already built is now like it's Jamstackified, like you still got to figure out how to hook things up to any kind of content management system. You still got to figure out how you're going to do stuff like rebuild all your pages, rerun Scully against your app really whenever content changes. Like that's a whole thing where you gotta like figure out those webhooks and distribute that throughout your CDN. But yeah, there's to be able to do something like that. My impression of Gatsby is you kind of have to be Gatsby from the start. I don't know if that's true or not, but it feels that's my impression of a lot of like SSR kind of approaches. And to
hello
project to me. Oh,
you froze for a second, I think.
Okay, are we good now? Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
Good deal.
Yeah.
I can hear you. Yeah, I think I'm just having some connection issues. It happens sometimes. But what was the last thing you heard?
You were just saying that you kind of have to be with Gatsby like from the get-go. That's the idea, as opposed to being able to like add it to an existing project. And I would agree. Exactly. But I think Gatsby's really an interesting alternative, in choosing the right tool for the job for like building things like documentation. They have a featured websites section, and actually I was interest to see that the TypeScript documentation website is built in Gatsby.
That's super cool.
And there's actually an article by one of the lead developers of the website at TypeScript talking about why he chose Gatsby and why he loves it. So it's definitely a good option if you're looking for something static, like a static site for like documentation or for a blog like I'm working on. For something that's more dynamic, not the right choice.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool, man. What's the motivation for building a blog? I'm building a blog too at the moment. So
you definitely inspired me to try working on a blog because
nice.
I needed a programming project, and talking to you about your work on your blog and then talking about really got me excited about trying to build a blog. But I also think it'll be fun to have a place to post any comments or thoughts.
Yeah.
Or maybe have something that you could have linked in the Twitter, promo you posted for this stream.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a lot of people that I have on here. I feel like I always want to make sure if they have anything to plug, we make sure we talk about it. But I feel like your presence on the internet is purposely obfuscated, and I respect that a lot about you. I wish I was more like you in some ways with that.
Yeah.
But
well, I'll have to come back on once my blog's up, and then I can shamelessly plug my blog.
There you go. Then you'll need a Twitter.
Yeah.
You can just say that it's your blog's Twitter though, so that way you're not really on Twitter. It's just your blog that is, right?
I like that. There you go. And then my Twitter can link to my blog and blog to Twitter.
Exactly. It all fits together. But yeah, dude, I've been having a lot of thoughts about the blog because I've been talking with. So I had Brian Love on the show a while back. He built this site called lookout.dev. Worth checking out if you ever have a chance. It's just like the idea for it is kind of like a low effort way to like almost put a post-it for knowledge you've gained. Right, some little tidbit of information. I think the other day in one of our meetings we found out there actually is a RxJS reduce operator, whereas I had always thought it was just scan. And so I did a quick little like post about that, just showing, hey, there's reduce and there's scan. Reduce only omits when it completes. That's the only difference. But yeah, it was kind of cool to see that. But to hear him talk about it. His goal is to like learn in public and to have a like digital garden of stuff you grow, and that I've heard that metaphor from Sam Julien, who I had on the show prior to, and I really wanted to do something interesting with that, like have something on like the front page that's like shows visually some. Maybe not like a graph. Like a graph's kind of too data-y. Like ideally, I'd want it to be like some sort of SVG that like shows like plants in some ground or something like that. And then you every now and then you can create a new section to it, and you say, here's a new plant. And like the plant could be some idea that starts out as just an idea, but then it becomes a blog. And after it becomes a blog, maybe it becomes a piece of video content or something like that. And just to be able to really visualize how these things grow, and to also like be able to show some actual projects out there that use that kind of stuff. And maybe those would be like pies on some display thing next to the garden, built with stuff that you built up in there. I don't know. There's something there. I think I'm looking forward to messing around with that. See what we can come up with. But
no, I like that. Well, one other thing about building a blog too is it's thought about using Medium to post content, but Medium oftentimes feels like the posts are a really targeted blast of information in kind of a good way, right? Like oftentimes I like find the solution to a problem on Medium in the same way you might on Stack Overflow.
Yeah.
And I'm writing code. but it doesn't seem like a good platform for like longer, fully fleshed out ideas. Which kind of what you were talking about, like a blog being a place where you could, like post those ideas about whatever.
Yeah.
And like how the collection of your ideas grow over time, kind of like what Brian was talking about, like a collection of your ideas for anyone to see or learn from.
Yeah,
a map of your learning.
Well, getting to a point where instead of just having a blog, I feel like, or like a one piece of static content, static. I mean, like you do it once and then it's out there. It kind of feels like the Medium way. That is kind of like classic blogging. It's rare that you would see someone go back and like update an old blog. But to build some sort of content that's purposely built for that. Hence like the garden idea. You can go from something that's continuously improving and changing to as you develop more knowledge or come up with better examples or better analogies for it. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like there's something there. I'd love to tackle NGRX's component suite or component store for that. It feels like it could be a good thing to like start out with some basic examples and then go into some more interesting stuff and keep building on top of it like that. So
I don't know about you, but I definitely feel like I learn concepts better when I recently sat down to write up some documentation about testing RxJS.
Yeah.
Like as I was writing this documentation, I realized like a bunch of things just kind of clicked, and I was like, oh, I get how this works now. I didn't understand this as well as I thought, and the documentation's like grown, and I feel like I've learned a lot from the experience of just writing in general.
Yeah. Yeah, no, for me, man, I don't know how much I learned by writing something out. Maybe I do, but I feel like the biggest thing for me is like my imposter syndrome gets triggered when I feel so bold as to put something out there into the world. And that's like, that will make me learn more about that topic than I had known about it in the past. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I also get that, right? Like putting something out in public, you've like exposed yourself to potentially have been wrong in public, which makes you want to make sure you're not wrong in public.
Hey, we've all been wrong in public before.
Yeah.
So that's I mean I still suffer from the imposter syndrome stuff. Like I'm just waving it off right now, but really like that can be a big thing for a lot of people. So I think the big thing is to realize it just happens, and sometimes we feel like imposters. We're all hypocrites as humans. Like at the end of the day, there's no one's perfect. Just embrace that a little bit. Not enough to be a jerk, but enough to have it like inform the way you interact with people. I think that's my little tidbit of truth there.
Yeah.
We had talked a little before we started about some things we wanted to talk about, and that kind of reminded me of the idea I had for like visualizing the garden or visualizing things growing inside of the blog I was telling you about. But we were talking about like visualizing algorithms. I thought that was really interesting what we were talking about beforehand. Do you want to explain to everyone a little bit what you were telling me about?
Yeah, so I've been so I have a good friend of mine is a designer, and he always like exposes me to interesting like experience UX, like design viewpoints to problems. So I was watching a talk by, I think his name's Brett Victor, who is a famous engineer or a designer, excuse me. And his big philosophy is that as you're creating, you should have immediate feedback into what you're creating, if that makes sense. You should be able to visualize it immediately and explore it. And that moves beyond simply like, writing code and then having it hot reload in your browser so you see it. His idea is like, as you're writing the code, like on the left-hand side of the screen, I guess this is the right for y'all, left-hand side of the screen. As you're writing on the left-hand side of the screen.
Stupid mirror.
As you're writing on one side, you see output of every line and the values of the variables on a line by line basis, and the results from your function calls as you're writing it. So you'll catch bugs and like understand what you're writing as you're writing it, as opposed to hitting run at the end, if that makes sense. And so he uses the example of like a binary search. He's actually built a small tool, which he demonstrates in the talk, where as he's writing it, like he'll declare an array and give it some values, and then he writes the algorithm and sees the algorithm running on the values that he started with. So he's like debugging and understanding and like getting a visual representation of what the algorithm is doing over time, like while he's writing the code, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Makes me wonder just kind of like why, after like I think 60 years of development, we haven't kind of modernized the way we think about writing code.
I wonder if there's a next step there, right? Because if we're able to make that step where we can see left hand, right hand, code versus result, if we couldn't just get to some sort of WYSIWYG thing where we're just messing with the result the whole time.
Well, classic Clojure plug from me. But really, this goes for any REPL-based languages. A lot of REPL-based languages, like that's the term, like read, evaluate, print, loop. Okay. But a lot of languages, Clojure included, have the ability to like load a program into memory. And then because it's an interpreted language, you can change the program, but keep all the state there. Right. So you can essentially like get real-time feedback as you're developing the code and without changing any of the application state, which is pretty close to what he's doing. They have plugins for like VS Code where you have your code on the left and the output on the right. Yeah. And you write code and then you like command click and it just spits out the output on the right. Like using the application state, it'll evaluate one function against the application, everything. Right. Which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I remember seeing when Flutter was first coming out. I think when they've had their first like their 1.0 release or whatever that was, there was they did like a live coding thing where they were coding a stopwatch, I think, or a timer program. And the whole time, I think they set a timer at the start for 30 minutes. And they started from scratch, so they started with nothing, just like a blank screen. But they were able to get like just like some text on the screen, at least at the start, to show, okay, we actually do have a counter that's counting down. But as they developed like this whole thing and the whole UX and the UI around it, the counter did one loop from 30 minutes to 0. And then the whole thing was they were trying to get it all the way done by the time it got to 0. But it was super cool to see I think they called it like hot reloading. So the state was persisting throughout, even though their code around it was changing. So that was super cool to see. But yeah, is that kind of getting at what you're talking about?
I think that's kind of like the end.
Sorry, is there a delay here?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Maybe a bit. I think we're good.
No.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Definitely. That's pretty cool. I was going to say, I feel like that's kind of like the end goal, right? Like how often we're working on a website, you make one change, like the website refreshes, and then you're like, all right, well, I'm going to go back to my URL and then click my button and then like, get back to the same place you were in the website just to see your UI change. Wouldn't it be nice if everything stayed the same when you click save on your file? It just like kept the state and changed the UI a little bit so you could see in real time the changes you're making without having to like go through the whole process of getting there again?
Maybe. I feel like some of that could be really confusing too. Like so I was doing a project not long ago where I was working on like E2E tests in Cypress. That was like actually testing the whole stack, where I had my backend as just like a node project inside of like an NX workspace. So they were all, it was all in there. It was all being served together. And the thing I really liked about that is you could start from some starting point. Like you could seed a database to show me, okay, this is the same starting point. Given this starting point, I should always go through these steps, and I should always succeed this way or fail that way. I feel like sometimes, unfortunately, in sort of like this, sort of like a Jenga tower of functionality we're building inside of our apps, sometimes it's just like if you were to make a change somewhere and you were persisting state through like reloading the app, you could get to like it. By the time you're at that point, yes, things are now fixed. Things are now fixed. Hey, Bailey, you're good. I saw your eyes closed and not come back. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I think I dropped out because I was like kicked out of the meeting room.
Yeah. I don't know what last you heard of what I was explaining, but I was just trying to talk while you were coming back. No worries.
The last thing I heard was you said you were recently working on a project running a node server.
Yeah.
That's kind of cut out.
Right. So starting the coolest thing I thought about that was running Cypress against an entire stack, to the point where you could like seed a database to get a common starting point. It felt like I was kind of working immutably with my tests and starting from the start and going through to an end, and seeing along the way all the steps are exactly the same as I expected. So I was not hitting anything outside. There's no like outside authentication or anything like that being hit, or any like cloud APIs. Everything was just being served locally, and that felt really cool to be able to do that. And I'm sure there's a lot of really neat stuff you could do with Docker and stuff around that too. But what I was getting to is that's kind of the workflow I see myself liking the most, where you start from like, if you make some change, I feel like you want to start from a beginning starting point and then make sure you can reproduce all the steps to get there. So kind of like macroing ways to get to a certain point in your application, because otherwise I feel like you could get, and I remember thinking this when I saw the Flutter thing, like their demonstration was super interesting and super impressive, but I kept thinking like, well, what if they made some change that like makes it look like it's working now, but you mess something up in like it in the code leading up to that spot that you wouldn't have gotten there anymore. Like the state they're in is actually invalid given their current code for someone starting from the very beginning.
Right.
Does that make sense?
That definitely makes sense. And I feel like the Flutter like tool chain and kind of what I'm getting at is more useful for like, you want to center a button, or you're trying to get the color of something perfect, right?
Yeah. No, I think like so a lot of this too is just breaking down a problem, right? And we want to a lot of times we want to break it down to the smallest piece. I think that's part of what you're describing now, right? Just like taking the smaller problem, like centering it during a.
Yeah, but it's like specifically, I guess. Well, my experience has been tainted. You can speak to the slow build times on the app right now at work. But like if I am working, I feel like I should be able to make a change in my IDE to a CSS file and just like kind of look over to my monitor and see the results of my change. And like right now, there's like a 30 or 40 second delay, which is where it's in a bad state in the app, but that's a whole nother story. But like it kind of gets to the point, right? And then even once you get there, like at certain points in the application, like if you had a dialog open, the dialog will close.
Right.
Like it feels like there should be a way to kind of instantaneously map back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. For things like CSS, I oftentimes will I've just gotten to the point where I write all my CSS in the dev tools.
Yeah.
For that reason.
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you can't. Sometimes you're like changing like a bunch of different components, and it's easier to like change the class.
Yeah, I remember especially. So I learned web development just by like getting thrown into Angular stuff, and CSS was by far like the hardest hurdle for me. So I was working with a UI guy who was, his main skill set was as a designer, but he also had some HTML and very rudimentary jQuery stuff, and very good at CSS, obviously. But yeah, like we would go through the process of just getting things how we'd like it in the browser, just through the dev tools. And then it would be like this other step for me to figure out how to make this work in terms of like the view encapsulation in Angular and all this stuff, and where should these things go. Thankfully, most of our stuff was in like one global style sheet, which I thought worked pretty well. But yeah, like even at the time, I wasn't super good at Angular because I'm just getting started. So a lot of the times, like he would hand me, we called it wireframes. So it was just like a running app, just pretty much HTML and CSS bundled together, and maybe a little bit of jQuery to illustrate like a transition here or there. But like getting to where like the DOMs were identical was, you couldn't do that, right? Because you've got your Angular components. I mean, I guess you could do that if you had one single component and we're doing everything that way. But like the DOMs are no longer identical, so you got to like figure out how to do this stuff, and like things, CSS rules where he'd say the immediate child of something matching this, that would all break down because now there's an additional layer in between where you have like the component element in between there. So I feel like that was one thing that really, if we had gone with React, I feel like that would have not have been an issue in retrospect.
I have such mixed feelings about how the DOM is so pure on React apps, because like I look at the DOM and I'm like, this is just so clean. This is exactly how I would write it.
It's too clean though. You can't tell what's going on.
That's exactly right. And then, at the same time, I'm like debugging something, and I inspect the source.
It's a lie.
In Angular, you can see like, oh, this is my component, and you can very clearly tell that it's in the DOM and that you're inside of it.
Yeah.
Whereas in React, like the lines of where things are is totally blurred.
Yeah. Well, I'm told there's plugins called, I think it's called React DevTools, that will really help with that problem in particular. But yeah,
React for it to get into those, but I've heard that as well.
Well, I did find that working with React, I don't know. Maybe it's because you're working a little closer to the metal. It felt easier to debug a lot of things too. Like, and maybe it was just I'm more just generally skilled at JavaScript than where I started in Angular. But it feels like debugging through different things is very straightforward, whereas Angular, getting a mental model for how change detection works, like getting a mental model that works 95% of the time is fairly easy to Angular's credit. But for times where you exercise that 5% that is your mental model can't grasp or can't accurately fill in for you, that's the kind of thing that can get really, really weird. Like when you start getting into zones, we were looking at a zone problem earlier today.
Yep.
That's like it's a whole thing. It's like it's hard to patch in a mental model for how that stuff works.
Full disclosure, when Aaron started talking about the zones, I was like, I'm gonna smile. I know
Black magic time.
I'm gonna suggest that Jordan make the changes that Aaron suggests, and I'm gonna just let Aaron take the driver's seat here. No, I completely agree. Angular, there's a lot of things that I like about Angular, but one thing that I actually do struggle with is that there's so many moving pieces that it's kind of hard to keep track of. And there's a lot of things that seem to solve similar problems.
Yeah.
For example,
services versus contexts in React. Have you encountered contexts in React before?
Yeah, I have.
Yeah.
They're a lifesaver.
Yeah. Well, it seems like pretty much it's just a component. It's just like a component in the tree expressed via like markup language. Like,
so I have a really different view of React components.
okay.
Because like an Angular component actually gets turned into like what do they call it? A web element or a web component.
But each component is its own tag, its own uniquely named tag.
Yeah. Whereas in React, that's not necessarily the case. So we've talked before about like a container component that just like formats data to give to the child. I like to think about things like a container component, the router, the React router that people use, or like a context. They're almost like middleware, in my opinion, because they don't change the DOM in any way. They don't end up in the DOM. They just like take data from above and transform it on the way down to the components that actually get put into the DOM.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's very much where I was trying to get at with that too. It's just really? Like the fact that they disappear, like putting all that stuff in a, like, say you had some parent-child Angular component. I don't know if I'd go so far as to say that's an anti-pattern, but I would start to get suspicious whenever I see a parent-child, just because, like, if all the parent's doing is some data-y things, I'd lean towards wanting to remove, combine them into a single component.
Yeah,
one of the biggest, go ahead.
I was gonna say you probably like lean on service, or if it's a lot of data on like NGRX or like a state management solution, right?
Right. Some like in Angular, I feel like you've got several tools that are just like data only, doesn't get into the DOM. The whole separation, I feel like, between templating and functionality in Angular is pretty solid in that way. There's some things that are, if you're in template, you're working in DOM. That I don't feel like that's, I don't know, maybe it's unfair to say that doesn't hold true in React. Maybe it does. I
think JSX is actually like misleading, because JSX is really just compiled down to JavaScript.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you ever actually looked at like what a really simple React component compiles down to, like the JSX, it's just like function calls on like an array.
Right.
So it's almost like in Angular, like your template stuff is pure DOM, and even in React, like all of your components are really just JavaScript in a way.
Yeah.
Just kind of like opposite end of the spectrum.
Yeah. Well, and also just like I've said this many times to you before, but the fact that Angular components are implemented as classes is unfortunate. I think, like, so much of the way I've come to enjoy programming in JavaScript doesn't deal with classes. So I don't know. I think moving away from that now would be this huge shift that's not worth doing, but it's almost unfortunate, I think, to still be in there. But like the whole point I was getting at is just like, if you wanted to do some parent-child componentry inside of your Angular stuff, you're literally changing the way the DOM works to make that happen, which kind of sucks. But in some cases, it may be what you want. I don't know. So it's interesting. I definitely feel like React gives you maybe a little bit more flexibility in there. To be able to create, well, like I said, if I wanted to create exactly the wireframes my friend was handing to me, I feel like it would have been much easier in React. I don't think it would have been possible in Angular to do it precisely. Like if I was going to diff the HTML or the DOM, it's impossible. But it feels like it would be possible in React. So I don't know.
Well, React, I feel like we've talked up React and talked down Angular, but I feel like it's definitely worth mentioning that React doesn't have one of our favorite tools, which is RxJS.
Yeah.
It's not easy to integrate RxJS into React.
Well, so Adam at Narwhal has several talks on using RxJS in React, and I see what he's doing in there a lot of times, but I feel like they're definitely two competing systems that don't fit well into each other. Like you can it feels like you could force them, right? And I think there's people who are doing that, but I just feel like the systems, like React is named React because it's trying to be reactive to you, and RxJS is just a different system for doing that kind of work, I feel like. So I don't know. I still prefer Angular. I'll put that out too, since we are kind of down talking Angular a little bit. But it's more just seeing how the other side lives. To me, that I think is super interesting.
Yeah, really writing in React is just. I chose Gatsby because I wanted to write in React after working in it with a friend recently.
Mm-hmm.
It's just it feels so simple to create a component and to like get something going in a React app. Whereas in Angular, it's like if you don't use the CLI, good luck.
Bits are off, yeah.
And even still with the CLI, you end up with like you create one component, you get 4 or 5 files, added things to the module. There's like more going on. Whereas React, it's like the sky's the limit. You just like you're running from like the start, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely. I feel like one thing I said a lot about when I was messing around with React, I could absolutely see just inlining components, even just being like, this probably would be a smell. I don't know enough about React, but declaring a component inside of another component doesn't seem like that weird of a thing to do, So,
yeah. Well, I think you have to be careful about that in the same way, just because from like a functional component perspective, right?
Yeah.
Like you'd end up redeclaring the function,
Each time.
the component every time the component was rendered.
Yeah, as opposed to just declaring the same function outside. If you're trying to set up your stuff so it's like an immutable data flow, it wouldn't make sense to declare the function inside of another function. So.
No, I have more or less done that, right? And it's like the very first website that I built was a game of solitaire, and we did it for one of my classes in school in React. And this is before React's functional components were popular, so everything was a class.
Yeah.
But we would have all these private methods in the class that just returned fragments of JSX, and we would just call those functions in the template, kind of like a mini component almost.
Yeah. It sounds a lot like an Angular component when you describe it that way, but maybe not so much. If the private methods are actually returning JSX, maybe not. That's more. I don't know. I mean, at that point, you kind of are like doing some little components, right?
Yeah, they're essentially like functional components as a part of the class.
Yeah, but there's no reason for them to exist. I don't want to say no reason. You probably could implement them where each one of those is its own component, and then have declared out in their own at sort of the global scope, and then do it inside of make some parent component and just bring them into it, right?
Yeah, you definitely could.
How did that work with class components though? I guess you could just. I don't know. I've been too far. I've been several weeks without touching React, so I'm spinning my wheels right now. But
what I will say is, I mean, we were new to literally everything. So I looked back on some of the code that I wrote, 2.5 years ago.
Oh,
I was like, oof. But definitely probably not React best practice. We were using it for in React, I think it's pretty common practice to in your actual render method, if something, return one thing else, return another, use the ternary operator to return JSX.
Yeah.
We were abstracting that into methods for
Gotcha.
no real benefit, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe. Well, any reason they were methods as opposed to functions? Was there something about the class properties that you were actually using?
No, this is just back before I knew about functional components. Like
Right.
at this point in time, I had been building websites for like 2 months and been working in React for like a week and a half.
Yeah.
So I was
Gotcha.
like trying to get things to work, and I'd do a lot of things differently if I looked at it now.
Yeah. Oh, dude, if I looked at my code from 2 years ago, I'm pretty sure I'd be like, what was I doing too? So
You know, I look at some of the code that we wrote, like that I wrote for work 6 months ago, and I was like, what was I doing?
Yeah, I feel like as soon as that's allowed to leave our heads, like I feel like I've done that with code I haven't touched in 2 months sometimes.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, I think a lot of times too, our minds benefit from taking that little break, breaking off our engagement with some projects, so that we can see like a lot of those times, those moments where we go, what were we doing? So, those are kind of our truest moments, right? Because we're able to distance ourselves away from it, and if we could always have that kind of perspective, even as we're writing it, I feel like that would be that's one of the things I feel like as I get more experience, it feels like it comes a little bit more naturally. But I definitely feel like it's still it's a very conscious effort to make sure I'm doing that. So.
Yeah, I think it's super valuable too, because like, I mean, especially in the industry setting, like we're going to be getting new developers in the team soon. They're going to be coming in and looking at all of our code for the first time, and they're going to be having the same reactions that we are. Like, what is going on here?
Yeah.
And if you keep that in mind when you're writing the code, like if I came back to this in 6 months, or if I had never seen it before, if I help you choose an approach, like a simpler approach to understand. Whether or not it's as clean of code, that might, be questionable. It's like, maybe it's a couple more lines, but it's more understandable 6 months in the future for you and for a new developer on the team.
Yeah.
That's valuable in itself.
Well, so those things that you just brought up, those are reasons. I love tools like RxJS and NGRX. Absolutely love them. I think they're amazing tools for helping make more concise code, for writing better code, for writing more complete code, and in the context of Angular, at least more performant code. But I worry about handing this off to someone 6 months down the road that I can't, if I can't talk to them and explain, hey, this is how this stuff works. They're coming from, they're some new grad out of college. I worry about dropping that all in their lap. The one like consolation I feel like I have with using a lot of those tools is there's plenty of resources out there. Like it's not my own system I threw together. It's an existing system with existing communities that they could tap into. Like the answers are out there. The answers don't die with me if I get hit by a car. I've definitely written programs before where the answers would die with me if I got hit by a car. So, yeah, but it's definitely something I think about a lot. Not enough to make me stop using them, but yeah, it's something I consider. So. I don't know, man. We've been talking for over an hour now.
Yeah.
This has been fun, though. I feel like it's mainly just our conversations we'll have at least once or twice a week, Capital One. So this is cool, though.
Definitely.
Share it.
As always, it's been a pleasure talking.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like you just. It's cool to work with you because I feel like you go out and you intentionally find things that are new and that are interesting, and you do them because they're interesting. And I love having conversations with you because I feel like I could get a lot of the benefit that you're getting from exploring these things without actually putting in the time to do it, which is, as a father of 6, that's a huge benefit for me. So I'm very appreciative to you for sharing all the stuff you're learning with me. So
well, I think I just had like two experiences in my college career that like really shaped how I look at programming. The first of which was I remember bashing on functional programming after like my second CS class, and one of the upper like classmen at that point, I was like a freshman or sophomore. He looked at me, he's like, "I think functional programming is the future." And this is the guy that I looked up to, and he was being dead serious, and I was like completely humbled. And like that just kind of like festered for a long time. Although I still think back to that moment, kind of embarrassed now since I'm a functional programming advocate. But I actually had a class that we used Clojure for. The professor chose a language that was kind of up and coming, but also that he thought no one in the class would know. So everyone would be on even footing starting the semester. So I was exposed to a lot of interesting ideas, and I saw them over the course of that semester. We talked about them. And they really helped me just like learn and realize like there's so many interesting ideas out there that like you wouldn't get in the mainstream. Whether or not they're going to be like, around forever or not, this is kind of a moot point. They're definitely worth learning.
Yeah.
So now
absolutely.
I do.
Yeah. Well, I think like being able to increase the scope of our exposure is such an important thing for us to do. I think regardless of what craft we're in, like as programmers, I think there's absolutely low-hanging fruit to be taken from people in other, adjacent gardens, like other adjacent orchards. They've figured out something. There's no reason for us to keep like charting ahead, like plotting our own course when we could just learn something that they figured out, patterns they figured out in the 70s, but also like to see innovation happening in Clojure and in what was their database? Datomic. Yeah, those are super interesting innovations to see. But ideas that I think we can take to our front end JavaScript code. I know I do that a lot, especially ties between NGRX. I see a lot of parallels between NGRX and some of the stuff they're doing with the Datomic, at least talking about it conceptually. But taking that and like looking to non-adjacent orchards as well to see other parallels, going to what Lucas was talking about yesterday. Different, like our brains in some ways act as neural nets we're training, and by exposing them to more and more a variety of like bizarrely different things, our brains are really, really good machines at being able to find value there and find connections. Like that's what our brains are really good at. So just throwing more into the pit and seeing what comes out, I feel like that's a super important thing to do. And I
guess I'll leave you with a funny machine learning story that I feel like is relevant.
Nice.
I don't know if it's well known, but I learned about this recently and I thought this is pretty funny. I think for a paper, some researchers tried to make a machine learning classifier, an image classifier that would identify wolves versus dogs.
Oh, okay.
And they did, and they had great results. And so they did some more digging into it, and they started looking at like which pixels in the picture actually are, most important, significant to that. And they realized everything around the wolves was what was really significant. It wasn't the wolf.
It was the context the wolf was in.
They realized that most of if not all the pictures of the wolves had snow in the background.
Really?
And so they'd really just built like a snow classifier.
That's really funny. Really good. They didn't have any pictures of huskies in there? I feel like huskies could have solved this.
But like the idea being that if you feed the same kind of data into yourself all the time, you might end up with what seems like the correct conclusion, but it can be very wrong. So like by exposing a larger variety of data, you can actually end up with more robust algorithms or a more well-rounded mind. Yeah.
I need to get a little bit into TensorFlow and that kind of stuff because I don't know. I feel like I think there's a high likelihood that'll be the future, to the point where the only computer science engineers may be AI engineers. Yeah. That's a whole other topic I don't want to get into now because we're already 15 minutes over. But
well, fun fact: Lisps were and still are super popular in machine learning. So,
okay,
learn Clojure, you need to be employed.
Nice. Sounds like good advice, Bailey.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, man, for coming on. I always
Thanks for
appreciate
having
your
me.
time.
As
And
always, great
yeah.
talking to you.
Yeah, man. Thanks everyone for stopping by. Tomorrow we've got Ben and Nicole from Narwhal coming by. I think we're going to talk a little bit about design systems and just a host of other things. So look forward to seeing you all then. And yeah, thanks for coming by. See you tomorrow.
Yeah.